The United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly yesterday to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. 141 countries in favour. South Africa was among 35 member countries to abstain from that vote. 5 countries, including Russia, obviously voted against that resolution. There's already a fair amount of criticism that a country such as ours, where sanctions helped bring an end to apartheid, has decided not to take a stand. Let's discuss this now with political analyst Richard Calland. Prof, what do you make of South Africa's decision to abstain? Do you think it's because they had, as they said, a problem with the text, which they were worried would drive a deeper wedge? Do you think it's because we're a member of BRICS with Russia? Or do you think it's because of deep historical ties with Russia?
It's a good question, and it's not an easy one to answer. I think it's a mixture of things, but from my conversations with senior DIRCO, Department of International Relations officials, people who are veteran diplomats, people whose professional skill and judgment I respect, it seems to me that the predominant instinct, the driving motive here was non-alignment, firstly, and secondly, a desire to push what South Africa has often pushed on the international stage, which is the notion of political dialogue. And in order to promote that position, it was important to them not to be seen to be taking sides. And of course, this is where it gets very sticky and very tricky, and why, in fact, the West, if I can use that term, is now, I think, very frustrated and in many cases angry with South Africa's position, because their strategy is to isolate Putin. And they wanted South Africa, they wanted the whole world to line up against Putin and his invasion of the Ukraine. South Africa, in the end, took a different stance. And of course, they privately recognized that there may be some naivety in this position, because, of course, to promote dialogue, you have to have willing players, protagonists. And is there any real evidence that Putin has a genuine desire to end this war, to head for peace until he's achieved his objective? And of course, his objective here, Sally, I would argue, is regime change. And interestingly, South Africa has on many occasions argued against regime change as a point of principle. So the question is, why could they not on this occasion have said, well, his attempt to enforce regime change in Ukraine is wrong in principle, it's a transgression of international law, and we must protect that. So it's a delicate and complex issue. South Africa has chosen a particular course, and it may have to face negative consequences as a result of that, because I think the West is frustrated and is in some cases quite angry with South Africa.
Our government has had no problem being very clear in its support of Palestine, which is also a very complicated issue. So we are able to take these stands when we have to. Is it a sort of a dual message, or do you think that the government is saying, well, case by case, we have to make our decisions?
Well, they say to me that context is crucial here. And of course, context always matters. The facts on the ground, the particular circumstances in which a conflict arises. And in this case, I think that part of that context is the build-up to this crisis in Ukraine and a sense that the security interests and concerns of Russia have not been properly understood or taken into account by the West, and that the West is, in some respects, responsible for what has happened. That, I think, is part of the thinking of South Africa's diplomats. And of course, the Palestine issue is part of the background to this, in the sense that players from the global south, like South Africa, are frustrated often by the fact that what they see as inconsistency and at times hypocrisy in the attitudes of Western countries. Western countries have lined up in force. Collective action has been summoned very rapidly in the past week in relation to Ukraine. Why not in the case of Yemen, or in the case of Palestine in relation to Israel's breaches of international law and incursions into Palestinian territory? That is part of the background. That then informs this notion of non-alignment. And of course, Western diplomats can't quite grasp the fact that South Africa is not a Western country, it's not a NATO country, it has different interests. And those interests, moving from principle to realpolitik, include having good relations with BRICS countries such as China, India, and indeed Russia.
It's interesting if you look at Africa as a whole and the countries that voted to abstain and the countries that voted in support of the UN resolution, it's a pretty even split. So as you're saying, is there sort of a geographical approach here? Because I suppose, there's politics and there's making a principal point saying, well, the US thinks it can do what it likes. Oscar van Heerden just a little while ago speaking to Shahan was saying a lot of people cite what happened in Afghanistan. Cites previous incursions into countries where the US has decided that they're weapons of mass destruction, for example. But I suppose what most people want to know is what is the moral right thing to do? Because we see over 1 million people fleeing Ukraine. We see a country being very aggressive and invading. Did South Africa morally make the right choice, in your view, in abstaining? Or did we miss an opportunity to be a moral voice, despite the non-alignment and the politics and the history? What is your view?
Well, I think morality in international affairs is a rather slippery concept. And the discussion we had a few moments ago about inconsistencies in foreign policy and in international order indicate that morality is often in the eye of the beholder and is often inconsistently applied. So I think what South Africa, I think, would say is that the principle here is one of political dialogue. I think the weakness in that position is potential naivety, as I said before, around Putin's stance and his potential good faith or lack of it. But also the question of sovereignty. And although last night's explanatory statement issued after the UN resolution vote, I think did more harm than good because it presented the idea of two nations at war when clearly that isn't the case. There is a powerful nation that's invaded another. On the other hand, that statement did add something to the earlier one, which was a talk of territorial integrity and sovereignty. And indeed, officials in New York that represent South Africa at the UN believed that that was a step forward, that was a strengthening of South Africa's position. However, it didn't play out well in the international arena. What South Africa was seen to be doing was, in effect, appeasing Putin's invasion. And that's a dangerous game to play, perhaps. It may do great harm to South Africa's reputation. And it clearly is going to have to work very hard in coming days, weeks and months to ensure that its relations with Western powers are secured and that people understand the background and history of South Africa's positioning here. As to Africa, well, we could spend the next hour trying to understand why the split in African countries was as it was. Some of those countries that voted for the resolution, like Rwanda, have particularly strong relations with Western powers. Others don't. It, I think, demonstrates that this is a complex issue. It also demonstrates that the roots and hangover from the colonial period hangs heavily over this continent, that countries are often reluctant to line up behind Western powers because they, as I said before, they recognize the inconsistencies in the application of international law principles to particular conflicts depending on where they are in the world.
Oh, thank you so much. Political analyst, Professor Richard Calland.